Well, good afternoon, everybody. I am absolutely delighted to welcome all of you to today's first inaugural episode of LightBytes, big subject, bite-sized. For the next few sessions, we are going to be looking at some subjects from the APM PMQ BOK7 syllabus. I am absolutely delighted to be welcoming all of you here today. My name's Jake. I'm the marketing executive at Training ByteSize, where I look after all of the physical and digital marketing. I just wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping and remind everyone that the session is being recorded and will be made available on demand on YouTube and on LinkedIn as well. So before we kick off, just a couple of brief things about Training ByteSize, who we are, what we do, and I'll also introduce you to our fantastic trainer for today. So Training ByteSize is a family-owned and run business. We offer a range of industry-leading project, program, and IT service management courses with exceptional pass rates, and we train delegates all over the world. It's probably easier for me to list the number of countries in which we're not training. We are proud to be a leading provider of APM training, from foundation, the PFQ, all the way up to chartered project professional status. We offer a wide variety of ways to study, whether it be online or a virtual session, not too dissimilar to today, or you can study with us face-to-face, on-site, or a blended combination of online and face-to-face. We are really pleased to be able to put on these webinars for you, and we'll be starting with the APM, and we'll also be looking at other subjects and qualifications down the line. So to today, I have the absolute pleasure of introducing you to one of our fantastic APM trainers who will be leading today's session. And that trainer is Callum Downing. Callum's been involved in project management for over 12 years now, and he's trained hundreds and hundreds of delegates in their APM qualifications. And his speciality is APM. So he's also a very, very keen musician, which I'm sure some of you on the pre-call heard a little bit about. But no, without further ado, I would like to pass everything over to Callum, and who will now lead the session.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jake. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Speaking of musicians, if you see that photo there, I actually do have a mohawk. If you're thinking, what kind of hairstyle is that? That's a mohawk when it's not spiked up. I've got rid of that. That was the last year, I think. But welcome. So let's get started then. So what we're going to look at today, then, we're looking at risk and procurement, and it's from the APM's Body of Knowledge 7 syllabus. So first things first, then, with risk, how we define it in project management is that it's an uncertain event. There's a few definitions on screen right now for you, but in a nutshell, I simplify it to: a risk is an uncertain event that can affect our project objectives or our ability to achieve project objectives. And the thing that people forget about that is it can be a positive or a negative effect. What I've seen I used to work in defense, by the way. I used to work in Ministry of Defense. That's where I've cut my teeth in project management mostly. And what you tend to find is with most organizations, with most industries, there's a bias towards looking for threats, which makes sense. People want to minimize bad things happening. But what ends up happening is they forget to look for opportunities. So we have this two terms, so opportunities being positive risks and threats being negative risks. So for me, the simplest definition of risk is an uncertain event that affects our ability to achieve the project objectives, and that effect is a positive or negative effect on our project. Uncertainty also means it's a future event. Something can't be uncertain in the past. It's always a future event. Risk is never something that's happened. I'll talk about something that happens in a minute. So the APM have a 5-step process for managing risk. Depending on who you speak to, they sometimes alter this last step, but effectively, just to keep it nice and simple for today, the five steps are: initiate, define risk management scope and objectives. I will bring up a bit more detail about all of these in a minute. I'll just bring up the process first of all. Identify the risks. Again, threats and opportunities noticed there. It's always about looking for those positives too. Analyze the risk. Understand its impact and probability. You might also see proximity in there, and people might assess how close the risk is to happening to. Response, so that's responding to the risk, and then closure. So the first step, initiate then, we tend to write up something called the risk management plan. I'll talk about those arrows in a second. So in the risk management plan, there's a few things we work out, such as roles and responsibilities and risk registers and things like that. But ultimately, it boils down to a couple of key things. So that's appetite. So how much risk are we willing to take? How much risk are we willing to tolerate? And attitude. So that's kind of attitude towards the risk. How much risk are we willing to take? But also, what is this perception-driven choice of a person? We kind of mean organization, really. So how would an organization react, or what's their attitude to the risks? Basically, how much risk is an organization willing to take? So that initiate step, what it tends to, it's two ways. If you're a new organization, you may not have this initiate step kind of sorted out with your governance. But most organizations nowadays have really strict governance around risk. So what I mean by that is they have their own internal rules that say this is our appetite for risk. This is how much risk we're willing to tolerate or take. So the second step, identify the risk, is to understand what types of risk we're going to face, what we might encounter, and then to also trying to think about who might be best placed to manage the risk. We won't necessarily assign the risk to anybody just yet. We'll be working out who would be best placed to manage the risk. We have risk owners and we have risk actionees. So risk owners are the people who are held accountable for the risk. They hold the risk. Risk actionees are the people who actually carry out the response, the actual work dealing with the risk. And usually they're the same person. And there's a key thing there at the bottom of that list I just want to bring attention to, which is cause, event, effect. One of the biggest pitfalls I used to see when we were identifying risk in defense and in industries I've worked with since working for ByteSize is missing the cause. People look for everyone gets some sort of effect, looking at the event and the effect, oh, this is terrible, this is bad. But people need to look for the cause, the why. And there's if you're engineering, if you come from an engineering back, you might have heard this thing called the 5 whys, which is you keep asking why. Why would this happen? Why would this happen? What would lead to that? What would lead to that? If you keep doing that, you'll end up with the root cause. And that's the bit you want to identify, that root cause. If you're identifying, for example, in defense, I remember a risk someone identified years ago, which was there's a risk of overspend. Of course there is, but why would there be a risk of overspend? What things could lead to that? And then when we analyze our risk, we're looking at the cause rather than the effect. Okay. So analyze is looking at 3 things, or 2 or 3 things, depending on type of organization you work for. Certainly the 2 most important or most common are probability versus impact. So probability, if you recall, if risk is uncertain, probability is going to look at how likely is the risk. You might even call it likelihood. Some organizations do. Versus the impact. So what's the impact on our project objectives if it were to happen? And then proximity is how close is the risk. So sometimes, not always considered, but some organizations do use proximity. Don't worry too much about Monte Carlo. Monte Carlo is a simulation. It runs your project 1,000 times using some data. That's a whole other, there's a whole talk onto itself, Monte Carlo. But I'll go through more. There's a slide on each of these, so I will be going through all of them in a bit more detail in a second. This is just an overview. And then we respond to risk. We have proactive responses. So that means we are doing things before the risk has happened. So rather than reacting to the risk, which is if the risk happens, then we do something, most risk responses tend to be before it happens. So we avoid, reduce, transfer, accept the threats, or exploit, enhance, share, or reject opportunities. So they are thinking, how do we deal with this before it happens? The last step, closure, when the risk has either happened or the event it was going to affect has passed by, the risk closes down. And at the end of the project, risk we hand over the risk register, we hand over all the key documents to the users, and then it's their problem. But ultimately, because business as usual is should be a low risk environment, there will no longer be any risks from the project that need managing, if it's been managed appropriately, obviously. So the 2 arrows then, going from response back into analysis and response back into identification, is implying that risk should be done throughout. Risk is not something we do once at the start of a project, or certainly shouldn't be. It's something we should be doing all the way through our project. Whenever we do reviews, we should be looking at the risks and saying, right, we've responded to this risk. Has it worked? Has it changed the place on the analysis? Has it moved the score of the risk? Has it identified or has it introduced new risks to the project? So we need to think about those. So this is a continuous process throughout from beginning to end of the project. So there's a few ways of identifying risk. There are way more than this. This is just a few high-level suggestions. There are lots of ways of identifying risks. So SWOT analysis, that's, I think a few of you probably may have heard of that one. So strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Looking at internal versus external environment. Brainstorming. I've encountered a few pushbacks on brainstorming, people saying, oh, it's a bit childish, and I disagree. Brainstorming, I think, is really, really effective, especially when combined with a workshop. When you get a group of people together discussing their ideas, you throw it into a bin, you talk around it, shuffle it around, and you work out something. Structured interview, so that's interviewing experts, people who could provide advice. Assumptions, we'd have to be very careful with assumptions. Assumptions are effectively a guess. For example, I can assume based on the weather here today, it's going to rain tomorrow. That's an assumption. It's a guess based on something. But what I could do to make that assumption more appropriate is analyze it and look at the weather forecast for tomorrow instead. So assumptions analysis simply means we can make some guesses based on the type of project we're working on, the environment we're working in, but we always need to back up those assumptions with analysis. We can't just leave them as a guess. They introduce new risk if you do that. It's, what is it? My boss at MOD used to say, assumptions are risks in disguise. Prompt lists, so that's kind of like a list of an acronym. What I always think of in MOD was tepid oil, kind of prompts you to think, right, what risk would be around this area, what would be around this area, and you kind of tick it off and go, right, let's look at this part of the environment, for example. Project context basically boils down to project objectives. What type of project are we doing? That can help you identify risks as well. Lessons learned. Now that's another one that I have a particular bone to pick with. Lessons learned should be shared. If we have shared lessons learned between projects, it means we can learn from each other rather than keep trying to learn from scratch again, make the same mistakes over and over again. We can use each other's lessons learned registers, lesson learned logs, whatever you want to call them, to inform our new risks. So we can learn from other projects without having to repeat the same mistakes. Project documentation, such as business cases, they could imply risk based on the type of context of the project, the environment of the project, the objectives of the project, how it fits into a program, can all be used to identify risks. And ultimately, the most straightforward one is comparing it to similar projects. If we're doing a project that's been someone else has done before, what risks did they face? And we can work it out. So if I'm building a patio, I'd go and speak to my neighbor perhaps and ask them, what risks did you encounter when you were making your patio? What problems did you encounter? What opportunities did you encounter? And then you might be able to use the same, or think about this, think in the same way for your patio. So when we assess risk, this is a general example. For example, when I worked in defense, we used to weigh it in favor of the impact. So you may notice there's numbers across the sides there. That allows us to score the risk. And it just notes down there that impact can be weighted higher than probability. I always used to do that because of the nature of defense, but some organizations weigh them equally. Effectively, it boils down to being able to give the risk a value. So we use grids because they're visual, they're easy to communicate. I did a course in Abu Dhabi a few weeks ago, and I just put a grid up and they said, what is that? I put a risk in the top corner, and they immediately knew without me saying anything, that was a severe risk. So grids can be really effective in that way. They can cross language barriers. But scoring the risk gives us a measurable, a metric we can use. So we can monitor improvement. So rather than just having an arrow showing where it's moved on the grid, we can actually give it a score and say, if we were to take this response, it would move the score from a risk score from 20 down to a 12 if we took this action. So you can use it to measure improvement using your responses or to help justify responses. You can also use it to monitor risks if they get worse, just naturally get worse or get better or improve, or if an opportunity becomes more greater weighted. You can also use scoring to assign risk. So going back to the risk owners and actionees, what you might have in your project is delegated authority. We don't want every single decision regarding risk to be made by the project manager usually, because that's too much. There's too many decisions that have to be made. So what we can do is assign accountability to people throughout, and we can use the scoring to say that. So if you're the project manager, you will only need to manage risks with a score of 15 or above. If you are the new apprentice who's just joined, who needs to get some experience, you can manage any risk with a score less than 4. So you can delegate the authority based on those scores as well. So it has multiple uses, but ultimately grids can be very effective. You sometimes see these grids colored in, by the way. In fact, I imagine most of you, if you've seen a risk register and a risk matrix, a probability impact grid is what I'd call this, you might have seen them colored in. That will reflect the risk appetites that we should have decided on in the risk initiate step. So there are several responses to risk. So we have threats, so prevent or avoid. So I always think of car driving to work with this one. So I could avoid the risk of getting a flat tire and being late for work by taking a train. So I completely changed the nature of my project, as it were, to get to work. But the problem with doing that is, yes, I've avoided the risk. There would be no chance if I take a train. The trains don't have tires in the same way that cars do. They don't get flat tires like a car does. So there'll be no chance of me being late for work as a result of getting a flat tire. But as a result of doing this approach, avoiding the risk, I have introduced new risks, the train being overcrowded, being late, etc. So when we avoid the risk, we change the nature of the project, but we have to accept that we might also introduce secondary risk, new risk to the project, which would also need to be analysed and identified and discussed. Because they might mean that the avoid is not really the most appropriate step. Reduce, so this is where we as the project team take action to reduce the probability or the impact. So if we go back to the car analogy again, I could check my tyres before setting off on a long journey. If I check my tyres before I set off, that would reduce the probability of me getting a flat tyre on the way to work. Or I could ensure that there's a spare tyre in the boot. That would reduce the impact because I wouldn't be as late for work because I could change the tyre at the side of the road. So you reduce the probability or the impact of the risk to it says acceptable, to a lower level, to a level you're willing to accept, I suppose. Tolerate is the word I was going to use, but it may not necessarily be in the acceptable level. It just might be better than it was before, if that makes sense. We could accept it. So this is where we take no further action, but we have identified the risk and we're monitoring it. We're keeping an eye on it. So if it does change, if things do change, we are prepared. We are already keeping an eye on it. This is where we might need a contingency plan, a backup plan. So if the risk does get worse, if the risk score does go up, then we initiate the backup plan, the contingency plan. The last one for threats is to transfer it. So to transfer to a third party. Most common is insurance in projects, which would mean you get compensation financially. We have to be careful with that one because is money the be all and end all of our project? Possibly not. So we have to be careful with that one. But if we again use the car analogy, I would take a taxi. So if I take a taxi, if the taxi gets a flat tire, I don't have to pay for a new tire. I don't have to get out in the rain and change the tire, but I'm still late for work. So that person, the taxi driver, is managing the situation on my behalf, but I would still be late for work. So what I mean by that is the risks would still happen to me. So if I transfer it to a third party, they would be managing it for us, usually because they're experts or something along those lines, but the risk will still happen to my project. It doesn't get rid of it. There's, again, a common misconception with transfers. We transfer it to them, it's their problem now. Not quite. If they don't manage it, our project is what gets affected. So opportunities then. So we can exploit the opportunity, sometimes known as develop. And this is to change the project scope, so quite significantly change the project, change direction to take advantage of the opportunity. So I would say maximize the opportunity or guarantee it happening, so make it happen effectively. But it does require quite a significant change to your project to do that. Change the nature of the project. So for example, the raffle. If we're going to buy a raffle ticket, we could buy a raffle ticket and there's an opportunity to win the raffle. If I wanted to exploit it, I'd buy all the raffle tickets. So I was intending to enter the raffle, and now my project has changed to I must win the raffle. I must guarantee it. So that'd be exploiting. Enhance would be to increase the probability and impact by changing something discrete. So not a change to the project scope, not change of direction, but changing something like rather putting a bit more money in perhaps. So for example, I buy 10 raffle tickets rather than 1, would increase the chance of me winning the raffle. We could share it. So for example, if I can't afford to buy more than 1 raffle ticket, I could get my family and friends to all buy 1 each, which again would increase the chances of us winning the raffle. Together we can then get the prize and we could then sell it or use it together or whatever. So you basically combine 2 parties or 2 or more parties to work together to achieve the benefits. Like a pain share, gain share. Together we have more chance of achieving the opportunity, we get more out of the opportunity, but if we combine forces, if the opportunity doesn't happen, then neither of us get it. Usually there's a contract in place. There's a benefits for both parties contractually with that opportunity. And last one is, let's not bother. Let's not buy a raffle ticket at all. Let's reject it. We'll keep an eye on the opportunity. There's an opportunity to win the raffle if I buy a raffle ticket, but is it really worth that money? So it's when you're not sure, but it's a bit like accept for threats. Is we are aware of it, we've identified it, but we're not taking any further action. But we will keep an eye on it just in case. If it gets better, then we might be worth looking at it further. So those are our responses to risks. This is something that this is another thing that can cause confusion a little bit sometimes with this one. Issues versus risks. So an issue is something that has happened that is a problem. So issues are never positives. They're always a negative thing. They're a problem. And it's something that has happened or is about to happen. So there's no uncertainty in an issue. It's going to happen or it has already happened. But the thing that gets a bit sort of lost a little bit here is that it's a problem that is so significant it is outside the authority of the project manager. The project manager cannot deal with it anymore. It's not their authority. It's above their tolerance line. So that's what that diagram underneath means. It's that an issue is a problem that has happened or is about to happen that exceeds the tolerances of the project manager, which means it requires formal escalation up the chain. So it could be to the sponsor, the steering group, program manager, but typically, generally speaking, we escalate the issue to the sponsor. So just a quick recap there. Issue is something that has happened, that's a negative thing, and it's so significant the project manager is not able to deal with it, exceeds their tolerance. PM escalates it up to the sponsor or whoever is most appropriate. And the sponsor will be the one who carries out or leads the resolution. And that's the last bit as well, is it must be resolved. Issues cannot be left to fester. They must be resolved. They require resolution. They can't be left. Otherwise, they'll derail the project effectively. Cool. Time for questions then.
Fantastic. Thank you, Callum, for taking us through some of the points on risk management. Something that came up in my kind of project management training was in everyday life, we tend to say issue, problem, and concern, that they are words we tend to use interchangeably, aren't they? So it made me sit back and really think about, am I being clear in my communication? It feeds into soft skills, doesn't it? So am I able to communicate clearly whether it's a problem or a concern, or is it actually an issue? So it's actually quite an interesting point. It's nice to kind of revisit that and look at the explanation. Fantastic. I have got a few questions for you from our chat. If you do have any questions, please pop them onto our Mentimeter. You can scan the QR code on the right or access via the link, the website there and the code, or you can pop them into our Zoom chat. Not a problem. Right, let's ask a couple of these questions. So, Callum, one question I've got here is, who can identify risks in a project?
Anyone. So that's a very simple cheat answer, as it were. Anyone can identify risk in a project because we have loads and loads of stakeholders. So we have our users, we have our sponsor, we have our steering group, we have people who are affected by the project outside the project. So for example, in defense, one of our key stakeholders would have been the general public to some extent. So anyone can identify risk. If someone sort of puts their hands up and says, there's a problem I'm aware of, then we should be thinking about it. But the more correct, I suppose, is we generally like to use the project team, because the project team are a group of experts. Project manager, project team, they're the experts we've hired or that an organization has hired or is using to deliver a project. Why would we ignore expert advice? So we tend to find that risks, so if you imagine the sponsor, so senior manager kind of level, they will identify strategic risks, so they can identify risks, but there should be, hopefully not too many strategic risks. So generally speaking, the day-to-day risk, the risks that are really going to interfere with your project or the opportunities that are really going to add value will probably be identified from the people who are on the ground doing the project, the experts. In the trenches is the term I used to say in defense. So.
Yeah, at the cliff face is another popular term, isn't it?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, I've got another couple of questions here. We've got time for. So another question I have here is, when in the risk process do we ensure that we have a risk register ready?
So initiate is where we develop a risk register. As I said earlier on, most organizations should already have one. So defense, we had something called ARM. It was a tool we used. A lot of organizations just use Excel spreadsheets, but something we need a risk register to go throughout the risk process. So we have the identified risk will go in the risk register. When we score the risk, when we do our analysis, the analysis will go into the risk register. Our planned response will go into the risk register. The score after the response should go into the risk register. So the risk register is a key document in risk management. So we should make sure that we've got that in the initiate step. So initiate is about understanding our risk appetite, but also it must be to develop or make sure you've got already a risk register to use throughout that risk process.
Yes. Okay. I mean, I do have a couple more questions here, and we do have a little bit of time, so why not? One I've got here is who generally assigns the risk score, and how often should it be reviewed throughout the project?
So that depends. So the risk score will need to be again, going back to this idea that the project team should be. I'm going to be very careful with my language. Should be a group of experts. So the risk score will be decided by the experts in the team. So part of the project team will be the ones who assign the risk a score, because they'll be the ones doing the analysis. The project manager will be reported on that. Again, project manager can't look at every single risk, because most projects will have hundreds, maybe more. So the project manager can't go through each risk and go, I will assign this a score. It's basically based on that grid. The experts will plot it on the matrix and then go, right, that's the impact times probability. The score is 20. So the project team, again, so long answer to that. Project team should be the ones who assign it the risk score. What was the second half of that question, Jake?
The second half was how often should it be reviewed throughout the project?
All the time. So whenever we should have multiple reviews throughout our projects. We have things like evaluation reviews or progress reviews, which could be monthly, weekly, fortnightly. It depends on the size of the project, the type of the organization you're in, how many reviews are required in governance, etc. But effectively, risks should be reviewed throughout. Basically, when I used to do it, it was every time we had a review, we'd look at the risk and go, right, let's look at the risk. We had a group meeting. We sit down with my team. We say, right, let's review the risks. Have they changed? Have they moved? And we did that. We had the last project I ran in defense was monthly meetings, which is what I always think of now. We had monthly meetings. We looked through those risk reviews. So constantly, basically.
Okay, fab. We've got quite a few questions here, so I'm going to try and pick out the best ones I can. We've got 1 or 2 more minutes just to answer 1 or 2 more. Another one we have here is where is it? There we go. Let's just get that up there. So one I've got here is assume the risk has occurred and is a problem now which the PM is working to resolve and is not deemed to be a candidate for escalation to sponsor. Do we record it as an issue in that case?
No. So an issue log is for, so we have a risk register, which is for risks, and we have an issue log, which is for issues. It only becomes an issue. It should only go in the issue log when it's deemed severe enough to be considered an issue. So day-to-day problems, so risks that have materialized, it's called realized risk is what the sort of formal term is. They are, if it's inside the project manager's sort of authority, I suppose, to deal with, then they can be dealt with by the project manager. They only require escalation when the project manager looks at this and goes, yeah. For example, if you imagine the slide with the risk register again on it, and there was the top right, the most severe risks, that would be basically saying that risk is very likely to happen and it has a massive impact on the project if it does. And we'll assume it's a negative impact. That's the kind of risk where the project manager might say, if this happens, that might become an issue. But if it's a low scoring risk that happens, it materializes, then the project manager probably could deal with it. So issues are only severe. They only get escalated or get captured separately to the risk register when they are severe enough to be considered issues.
Great. Okay, I've got 1 more question on this issue. I've had a few questions come through concerning documentation and where the risk register falls as a formal document within the project management plan. So just to kind of combine these questions together. So at what point, should the risk register plan be created, and how does it relate to the other documents in the project management plan?
So the risk register, as I said, most organizations will already have one. So, for example, defence had one. We already had Risk Register. We had a tool we bought to capture it in. Not all of defence used it. But that's again a whole other story. So most organisations will have this is the tool we use, and you just basically lift it from the template and then you use it. But if we haven't got one, effectively, if we imagine the life cycle, if we go with linear life cycles, we've got concept, which is where you work on your ideas and develop a business case. Definition, which is where you start doing your project management plan. Deployment is where you actually deliver your project. Transition is where you transition it over to the user. You finish your project up and hand it over. We need to make sure we're writing our risk register in our definition phase. So it's happening early. I wouldn't expect it to necessarily be part of a business case necessarily, but I would say we want a risk register as early as possible, really. So again, like most organizations will already have one, but we need to make sure we write a risk register in the definition phase. Regarding how it sort of interferes with, interacts rather with other documents. It's not necessarily how the risk register interacts with other documents, more about how risk interacts with other documents. Risk register is more, so if you imagine in the initiate step, we're writing something called the risk management plan. Let's go into a bit more detail. We have something called a risk management plan, and that's kind of our overall plan. And in that plan, it will say, this is the risk register we use. The risk register is more of an active document than a plan, really. So it doesn't really sit comfortably in the PMP in the sense that the risk management plan does, because the risk management plan is you fix it, that's the plan we're using. The risk register, we fix the template, we fix the structure, but we add risks to it. So it's more something we're using throughout deployment. So it interacts with things like, well, how does the risk affect stakeholders? So the risk register will say, right, based on the risk we've identified. So when I did my meetings every month, we look at our risk register and say, right, here's the risk. This is the effect it's having on our project. We then look at the comms stuff and say, right, what communication do we have to tweak or change or send out based on those risks? Because that might affect your comms plan. You might also say, right, this risk here, that this is so severe, it's going to interfere with our quality stuff, and it might derail our quality standard. It will mean the project is no longer able to achieve our quality standard. How would we manage that risk to bring our quality back on track? So it might interact with your quality management documents as well. So your quality reviews and things like that, your testing. So it interacts with all of them, but it's a very hard question to answer with a distinct answer, because it effectively, based on the risk score and what response you want to do, you'll then need to assess how would that affect other parts of the project. So that would be how it affects the other documents, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, I'm going to squeeze in one more question, only because it's quite a practical question and might well be applicable to many people on the session. The question is, so I struggle. It's more of kind of an open-ended question, but I struggle with the risk scoring in my organisation, because what is regarded as high risk to me for my project may be just a small issue in the whole program, and often I am told to reduce the probability.
Right.
It's more open-ended, but I wondered if that is something you've ever encountered.
Yes. The reality of working, and this may not be. The reality of working in a program is when you're a project manager, your project is the king. Like, this is my project, it's my baby, it's my precious thing. It's that. I'm really protective of it. I want to see it succeed and everything else. But the reality is, when you're working as part of a program, it may be that there are other projects that take priority over your own, and the program manager's trying to balance those projects, and they may take things away from you or sacrifice something in your project to favor another project that's a higher priority, or is it a greater risk, or whatever. I would say I don't really know whether they're asking you to change the probability. I don't know why they would be doing that. I don't see what the value of changing probability would be, because it's still, if you've identified as probable, it's just the program manager needs to say, this is less priority for me at the moment. I don't know why you need to change it. I'm not sure how to respond to that one. I've never changed the risk probability to fit into a program. But I recognize that program manager will be balancing lots of other projects, but I wouldn't change my scoring to reflect that, personally. I'm not sure why they're asking to do that. So I can't really answer that, I'm afraid.
So the question said it's for reducing probability and impact as sufficient. There's a character limit on Menti.
Okay, right. I don't know. Yeah, again, not sure. I wouldn't personally do that. I'm not sure where they're asking you to do that. Again, I can understand why a program manager would say this is less of a priority right now, but that's kind of fudging to me. Again, I don't know the context this is in or anything. I don't know the type of organization it is, but that sounds like fudging, and that's it's a dangerous road. I think that one. But I guess it's one of those things down to communication again. I'd sort of push back if you can and sort of challenge, say, I appreciate we may be a low priority, but why would we need to change the probability and impact if this is what the score is? Or is the scoring system we're using not appropriate for the program? Because if you're working as part of a program, one of the things that definitely should be in place is a consistent risk scoring system. So you shouldn't really have lots of projects with different scoring systems. They should have the same scoring system. And if their scoring system is basically different to your own, then I would push back on that. If they're asking you to change the impact and probability just because they don't like it, I don't think that's necessarily the right thing to do personally. I haven't got an answer to how you'd solve that other than communication and discuss with the program manager and push back on it. But
fantastic. Communication is such an important kind of key skill to make sure we're all getting along and making sure we're prioritizing correctly, etc. So we've got a couple more questions. I'm afraid we have run out of time. We've got to move on to our next topic, which is on procurement. So Callum, I'm going to mute myself and hand over the floor.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Jake. Cheers. So procurement then. So procurement is effectively buying stuff. That's all it really is. There's a nice long definition on there for you. Incidentally, if you are thinking of taking the PMQ, PFQ, perhaps you need to be a bit more savvy with specific definitions, but certainly the PMQ, you don't need to be as focused on remembering full definitions. So for me, procurement is buying goods and services from external parties, in a nutshell. So external means outside the project. It doesn't mean outside the organization. Usually, most of the time, it is buying from somewhere outside the organization, a supplier or a contractor or a company or whatever. But you can procure from inside the organization if you're in a large organization. So I always think of defense again when I think of this one. Because we have such large, the MOD is massive. It has the Army, Navy, and Civil Service, and defense equipment and support and things like that. You have these things called service level agreements, which are agreements between functions in an organization. If it's a larger organization, generally, it might be a smaller one as well, but generally speaking, SLAs, service level agreements, tend to pop up in larger organizations. But effectively external to your project, buying things, goods, services, whatever, outside your project. And it does require a legally binding contract. And it's informed by, again, it ties into your project management plan. So this is something we need to make sure we're doing as part of the definition phase of the linear life cycle. So we don't want to be planning procurement into deployment when we're actually doing the project. That's too late. We need to make sure we've got a clear, in fact, when we write business cases, one of the key parts of your business case you might write is a procurement strategy. So you're trying to think early on about how we're going to buy stuff for the project. And we think what type of contract we're going to have, what type of terms and conditions are we going to have, how are we going to buy stuff, what approved suppliers already exist, and where are we going to get that list of approved suppliers from. We're thinking about procurement fairly early on because it will go into contract. And once we've contracted something, that's it. It's legal then. So we have to be very careful with procurement. So procurement strategy then, a few key documents that goes in here. So you might find this in the business case if you're thinking about it early on, but it would certainly be in the project management plan, this at the very latest. So typically includes a make or buy decision. So that's, do we make it ourselves or do we buy it in? And there's a whole list of disadvantages and advantages to each of those. Making it gives us control over it. For an organization that wants to sell something, we could license it. Once we finish making it, we could license it, sell it, or make profit off of it. Or we could buy it in, which is what defense used to do quite a lot of. We don't necessarily have the skills ourselves. We haven't got the time or money ourselves. We'll just hire a company that has 30 years of experience doing it in, just buy them in. So that single integrated or multiple is, do we have one supplier to do it? So we partner up with them so they become part of the same, so they integrate into our project team in some capacity, or do we have several suppliers doing parts of our project for us or delivering parts of our project for us? You tend to find multiple suppliers happens if you have a very broad requirement. Contractual arrangement. So contractual arrangement is, do we have a single contract or a comprehensive contract rather, parallel contract? Do we have a subcontracting arrangement? Relationship is, do we have a transactional relationship or a long-term relationship with them, or do we go into an alliance with them? So we need to think about that before we start buying stuff as well. Supplier selection, I'll talk about in a second. Types and forms of contract, so terms and conditions. So we have bespoke contract, which is custom. So your contract doesn't exist in any other form before you arrange it. So you write it up specially for your project or your need, or whatever. Then we have standard or off-the-shelf contracts. So mobile phone is what I always think of with an off-the-shelf contract. You go into a phone shop, you say, I'd like £20 a month, 100 minutes or whatever. There you go. And it's the same contract. Someone else could come in later on that day and buy exactly the same contract or enter into exactly the same contract. So you have standard or off-the-shelf contracts as well as bespoke. Again, type of organization you're in will usually dictate whether you have lots of bespoke or standard. Defense, we had lots of bespoke contracts. So how are we going to pay people? That's payment mechanisms and methods of reimbursement. And it's best left to professionals. So procurement professionals, there's a lot of danger in procurement. So it's best left to the experts. Again, your project team is a group of experts. Leave it to the experts. The project manager does not need to be an expert in everything. A good project manager will surround themselves with experts and delegate the right work to the right people. And this is very much that case. Delegate to the experts. It'll make things cleaner, simpler, and more straightforward. And it boils down to that statement at the bottom of the PowerPoint there, which is ethical, transparent, and in line with organizations' procurement policy and governance principles. Basically, there's a lot of law in procurement. So being ethical and transparent means we won't get sued. Cool. So here is a typical supplier selection process. What you'll probably find is if you were to go and investigate your own organization's supplier selection process, it may not look exactly like that. You might have a couple more steps in there, perhaps, such as market risk, industry days, or maybe reviews and things like that. But ultimately, it will look something along those lines. So research is we need to make sure we have clear requirement. That's the most essential thing in the project, really, more than anything else, but certainly in procurement, is we must make sure we have a clearly defined requirement. If we go into a procurement process, a supplier selection process, without a clear requirement, we say we need something. It's like you go into a car dealership. I'm into my cars. So go into a car dealership and say, I want a car. And they say, well, what car would you like? You go, I don't know, I want a car. You're not going to get something very quickly, and you're probably not going to get something that really satisfies you. But if you go into a car dealership and say, I need a car with 5 seats, I need it to be 35 miles to the gallon when I'm driving on the motorway, I need it to be this, this, and this, you'll get what you want. So the same with supplier selection. You need to make sure you understand your requirement before you go anywhere near this process. Research also looks at researching suppliers. So do we have lists of approved suppliers already? So we could go to our administrative people, our project management office, they're known as, or project support office. We go to them and say, right, what list of approved suppliers do you already have? If we don't, we do some market research and find out what suppliers perhaps could do the work for us. So the second step, pre-qualification, you could call that pre-qualification questionnaire if you wanted, is where we send out a standard questionnaire to all the suppliers who've expressed interest in our requirement or delivering our requirement. We send them out a questionnaire that says, let's have a look, that could prove it to us. Prove to me you could meet my requirement. And they will fill out this questionnaire, and it's the same questionnaire for all suppliers. We don't want to send different questionnaires we don't send a nice questionnaire to our favorite supplier and a rubbish questionnaire to our least favorite. We send them all the same questionnaire. It's a standardized questionnaire. And they'll fill it out based on our requirement. Can they do the VAT and all their sort of processy stuff, but also, can you deliver our requirement? It won't be the full requirement at this point, it's just a high level look at the requirement. And what this will do is it will filter out any sort of suppliers who are kind of not able to really do it. They're just trying it on, or they can't really fulfill exactly what we need. So we can perhaps go from hundreds of suppliers using the pre-qualification questionnaire. We can narrow it down to maybe a few. We can then take the few who've got through that pre-qualification step to tender. So we can issue them an invitation to tender or invitation to negotiation. There's lots of different words for it, or phrases for it, but tender is the kind of generic one, where we can invite them to start bidding. And so basically we give them the full requirement, say, right, here's the full requirement, show us what you could do with it. How much would it cost you how much would you charge to deliver this requirement? And they'll bid on each other. They'll sort of interact with you based on what your requirement is. They'll offer you things. Again, it might go to an auction if you've got a few suppliers. It always generally did in defense. There's a few exceptions, but generally there's always an auction in it. If a supplier asks a question, you need to be, again, ethical and transparent with it. If it's not commercially sensitive in any way, if they're asking a question, you need to make sure that you send that question to all the other suppliers as well, to make sure things remain transparent and fair. If it's not transparent and fair, so if you do answer a question and the other suppliers don't get the question and your answer to that question, you could be challenged later on. So you have to be very careful with that. Again, hence left to the professionals. Award is where we will, those suppliers will finalize their bids. We'll answer any questions, any queries, and we will pick one of our suppliers who say, right, you're the one we're going to go with, sign a contract, negotiate a few bits and bobs, and sign, done. And we have to give feedback to the other suppliers and say, this is why you did not win. Again, being clear, and this is where the suppliers might challenge you and say, we think we should have won that. You've favored that other supplier. And if you've been transparent and fair throughout, they won't have any grounds for it. But if you have been unfair or unethical, suing. So that's those four there are the supplier selection process. Manage and close are kind of post award. So we've agreed a contract. Managing the contract needs to be active and not passive, and be proactive and engaged. We don't want to leave our contract once we've agreed it with our supplier to fester and die. We want to minimize changes to it. We want to minimize amendments. That's what they're called in contract management. We want to minimize amendments to it because it basically says the contract wasn't very good or it was incorrect first off. So we want to make sure we get it right first time if we possibly can. If it's not going very well for us, rather than leaving it, we deal with it. We approach it and say, this isn't working, let's deal with it. So it's active, not passive contract management, making sure it serves both parties, because both parties want to see their terms and conditions, their output of that contract delivered, and they don't want to be left, lost at a loss for it. Eventually, though, the contract will reach an end and we will finish it and it will close off. We need to make sure any payments are dealt with, any terms and conditions that have been outstanding to be closed off and dealt with. The contract is over, therefore everything it relates to must be closed down. There can't be little bits hanging over the end. It must be all shut down once that contract is over and closed. So that's a typical process. For the PMQ, you could use that. I always think that the first four are the good ones to talk about there. But again, if you're doing a PMQ, so you're looking at doing an essay style exam, if you know your own process very well in your own organization, you could actually use your own process to describe it, because it will be a supplier selection process. It's just a case of it might give you a bit more to talk about if you're familiar with this process. Cool. So contracts, everyone's done contracts. I imagine you have. When you browse the internet, you clicked accept on those cookies and had all your data taken from you. Check out the terms and conditions in those, by the way, if you haven't already, because they get a lot of data off of you. Contract is a legal agreement between two or more parties. Can be verbal. We don't like those in projects. We want them to be documented. We want a recorded contract with our suppliers and with our stakeholders if we've got work with them. And it will detail terms and conditions, what we do, what our end of the bargain is, and what their end of the bargain is, and then we can hold them to that contract. Those terms and conditions, again, if you're doing a bespoke contract, those terms and conditions will be based entirely on what you need from each other. If you've got an off-the-shelf contract, you might find those terms and conditions are pretty standardized. It does depend. And again, this is all something we need to have decided this before we really start thinking about going through the procurement strategy. We need to know already what kinds of terms and conditions we want to see, rather than get to the end of that supplier selection process and go, oh yeah, we need to think about terms and conditions now, don't we? We need to be doing it early, planning ahead. This is something else that's worth considering, is that we want to make sure the right people are signing contracts, because in MOD and defence, anyone who worked in defence can agree a contract with somebody else. But the only people who are allowed to were the commercial, the procurement arm of the defence, of DNS, Defence Equipment and Support. The only people who are allowed to was the experts, because contracts are legally binding. And if we break contract, then we can be sued again. So again, there's lots of law around procurement we have to be careful of. So contractual arrangements or relationships, we have something called comprehensive. So this is where you have one contract with one supplier. Means everything's nice and simple to manage, low resource for you as a customer. But also means that supplier, you're putting all your eggs in one basket in theory. So if that supplier has a problem, you have a problem. Also means that you can't really have a particularly broad requirement. If that supplier can't meet something, then you are stuck with that supplier and whatever they can do. So we could do a parallel contract. So parallels, we have multiple contracts running alongside each other. So you might have multiple contracts with multiple suppliers. You might have multiple contracts with one large supplier possibly, and they will be doing different things in parallel with each other. They'll be running alongside each other. So multiple contracts kind of deals with the one supplier problem. You have multiple suppliers potentially doing parts of your project, which means you're not putting all your eggs in one basket anymore. Or we could do a sequence where there's one contract after the other, again with the same or different suppliers. So one contract finishes, then the next one then begins. Once that contract finishes, the next one then begins. So it gives you nice control and organized contracts. Then we have subcontracting. I imagine most of you are probably familiar with that one, subcontracting. But we have one price. We have a contract with a prime supplier, and that prime supplier then subcontracts out to other suppliers. We kind of get the benefits of both comprehensive and parallel with that one, in that we have low resource. We only have one contract to manage with our prime supplier, but also we have a broad range of suppliers potentially delivering a very complicated requirement. So if the prime supplier can't do it, they could subcontract out parts of the requirement to be dealt with by other subcontractors. So you can have a wide-ranging requirement, but you only have to manage one contract. There are some considerations with subcontracting, and things like ethics and terms and conditions you want to kind of filter down. If we don't make our prime contract very robust, then it gets weaker and weaker the further down that subcontracting kind of chain, supply chain it's known as, you go. So it does require careful management, and it does involve lots of communication happening. If communication is poor throughout a subcontracting arrangement, that can cause problems for us. We need to make sure there's nice, clear lines of communication between us, our prime supplier, and then making sure they communicate clearly with the other subcontractors, because we do not have a contractual relationship with our prime supplier's subcontractors. Our contractual relationship is purely with the prime supplier. So that can introduce trouble as well, we have to think about. Last one then is partnering or alliance. So this is where we have rather than going into, this is a very long-term relationship, this one, it's a kind of mutually beneficial situation where we share the pain, share the gain. I always think of Hinkley Point C with this one, where they did something very clever, which is they, rather than getting a big corporate entity to kind of do the catering, they went to all the local community, local villages and local farmers and everything, and they said, right, you're a baker, could you provide pastries to our Hinkley Point C, please? And we'll inject some cash into your bakery to upscale it a little bit, so you can provide more sort of industrial level of deliveries, but we'll buy from you. So we'll pay you a load of money and you sell to us. If we win, you win. If you win, we win. So it benefits both of them. So this is for long-term relationships. So joint ventures and collaboration, and when you're you want to keep working with someone over a very extended period of time. You might see these more in programs, for example. But again, projects, you might have one project, the next project will also be using them as well. So you want to have a long-term relationship. It doesn't really work with short-term. You can't really alliance with someone for a very short period of time. It doesn't really work. It's about that long-standing relationship you build, where you both get advantage from. You both work together, but does require some careful negotiation to get working. So pricing types. So simply put, it's kind of, some of these are about risk and who takes the risk. So fixed price is where the supplier takes the most risk, because we set a price in stone and we say, right, this is the price we're going to pay as a customer. That's it, doesn't change. So if the supplier's costs change, it will not change for us. We always pay the same price. So it's, generally speaking, the risk remains with the supplier here, which means we will probably have to pay more initially because we have to cover their risk to an extent. So it'll be one fixed price, does not change. Cost plus fee is where we take the risk. So where we're not necessarily sure what the final product will cost, if there's a bit more if there's a bit more scope to be flexible with our costs or our scope, then we will trust the supplier to manage it. If the price goes over, to protect the supplier, we give them a guaranteed percentage of profit. So it's sometimes fixed fee. So it might be, for example, we have a cost plus with our original planned cost of £10,000. We agreed to £1,000 fixed fee. If the costs escalate for the supplier, they will escalate for us as well. So if the supplier says, sorry, it's cost £14,000, they will guarantee on top of that £1,000 fixed fee. Or it could be as a percentage, a 10% fixed fee or 15% fixed fee or something like that. It does depend on the nature of the contract and the nature of the supplier, but effectively it's to protect the supplier whilst allowing some room to be flexible with our costing. So it's something novel or new to perhaps develop. Per unit quantity, so this is price per item. So we work out how much one thing costs, or how much someone's day costs, or whatever, or hour costs. So if we're not sure how many of something we need, we work out how much one costs, and then we can scale it up. Sometimes known as bill of quantity. So if I want to work out how much one pen costs, I might need 10, but I think I could need more than 10. If I need 50, if I work out how much one costs, I'll know how much 50 will cost if I need more. So it's per unit quantity is price per item, or price per day, or hours, or whatever. And target cost. So this is shared risk, this one, pain or gain. So effectively we have a idea of a cost and we aim to meet it. So for example, if we have £10,000 target cost, If the supplier goes over that, they end up saying, sorry, it cost £20,000. We'll say, well, you've exceeded the target. We wanted it for 10. We'll give you 12. So you're penalised for going over. So we don't pay you all of it. We pay a little bit more. We don't pay all of it because you've gone over. You said you do it for 10. You've done it for 20. We're going to penalise you for it. But conversely, if the supplier says, I did really well, I got it in for £5,000, we go, brilliant, we'll give you 9 then. We get it cheaper and you get a massive profit. So we both win. So target cost tends to be for very long-term relationships. It doesn't really work that well for short-term because the supplier might cut corners to get it in cheaper. But you tend to find that works really well with long-term arrangements, target costs. Last couple of bits then. Pay by milestone. So milestones are a point in time with no duration. You could say, right, at this milestone, we'll pay somebody. So when certain events are completed, we could pay in stages. So we break our project into stages. We could pay at the end of a stage, possibly at approval gates where we sign off a project to go further. We could hold back a retention payment. So rather than paying all of it, we pay most of it, and then we hold back a little bit of money until we've used it for a little while. And if it hasn't gone very well for us after using it, we say, you've messed up. We'll keep that retention payment as a way of apology to make up for the fact it's not done what we expected it to do. Price adjustment is where we allow the price to change based on, so for example, inflation. Usually what I had to do with steel. Price of steel fluctuates quite massively. So we allow that to change. So if the price of steel goes up for the supplier, it will go up for us as well. And liquidated damages is compensation. So if the supplier causes damage for our project, so delays, significant delays, or damage to a product, whatever, they will compensate us for it. Cool, and that is a very quick squiz through procurement. I apologise, I did sort of cut it to the wire there, but any questions at all?
Yes, we've had a few questions come in. So I wonder if I could just run a couple of them past you now. Yep. I have one here, which it asks: would procurement include a project borrowing BAU resources? And is that only buying or borrowing physical resources, or is it perhaps paying for specialists for a set time, for example?
Wow. Okay. If we're getting resources from another part of the organization, then yes, effectively, it's if there's money being transacted, then yes, there's we need to. It's not our resource. We're borrowing or whatever. I wouldn't worry about the word borrowing, because if we're using any resources from anywhere else in the organization, we have to secure it in some way. Again, usually money or making up for it somewhere else, whatever. That would be through your service level agreements, for example. So we have an agreement to say, right, you will give us. So if you have a function that's all about, for example, a risk function, so can we have some of your resources, please, to support our project? If we have that agreement in place, then yes, it's procurement. Again, it may not necessarily mean money is transacted. It just means securing goods and services, but usually it will involve some kind of money or consideration in the project. You'll have to fund those people's salaries, for example, possibly, or something like that, using the project's budget.
Okay, I've got one more question I can squeeze in, and that is, can you have a tender where companies can bid on certain aspects, or do they need to bid on the tender as a whole?
Having never been involved in anything like that, whenever I've done a tender, it's always been for the requirement, or certainly the bulk of the requirement. You might find, I suppose, that suppliers could. It depends how you've arranged it, really. So you might have parts of your requirement kind of set up as distinct things. Then you would procure based on that part of the requirement, but they would all be in their own procurement process, I would say. You wouldn't have them all sort of in one thing, and then you sort of split it out between suppliers in one procurement. I would say, based on my experience anyway, it would be, right, we're procuring this part of the requirement, we bid out for that part of it, we do a separate procurement, a supplier selection for that part of the requirement. I wouldn't say you'd do, here's a really broad requirement, fight against it and work out who would do bits of it. That wouldn't really work very well, I don't think. Again, I'm speaking from my own experience here. They might be able to do that. I don't think you can. I think it's you bid on different parts of your requirement split into sections, I would say.
Fantastic. So I'm afraid that we have... Sorry, does procurement include material and resources only, or people and specialists too?
All of them.
All of them.
Procurement, yeah. So for example, you could hire someone for their expertise. So I'd like to procure you into my project for your expertise. So it can be resources is people and materials and everything. All right.
Okay.
Just all of it.
Great. So thank you everyone so much for submitting your questions, both into Menti and via the chat. Callum, if you could just go to the next couple of slides for me, please. And next. So at Training ByteSize, we do a variety of fantastic training options, many of which are with Callum because he's one of our fantastic and very popular trainers. We do offer bespoke solutions and online self-paced study solutions as well. We even have a free demo of our APM PMQ, which I've just popped into the chat. So if you'd like to have a go of that and get an idea of what the online learning is like, it's what I use to do my training. I love the thing. I really enjoy it. And just to remind you that do follow us on LinkedIn and on YouTube. We will be making this video available for you to watch on demand. So when you're watching us on YouTube, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Cal, could you do that final slide for me?
Yep.
And sorry, there's only one thing left to say, which is thank you to all of you for attending today. We've had a fantastic reception, and people have really enjoyed it. From what I'm seeing in my chat here, people have really enjoyed the session, and we look forward to welcoming you to the next episode. The next episode is taking place a week tomorrow, and that session will be on budgets, cost, and earned value management, which is a really great subject to get your teeth into. So one more time, I'd just like to say thank you to all of you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.